Longevity is the Jewish response to anti-Semitism. We will ultimately outlive our enemies and celebrate.
My guest today is Rabbi Aubrey Hersh, who, for the last 21 years, has served as the Senior Lecturer and Projects Director at the Jewish Learning Exchange, or JLE, in Golders Green. In addition to delivering lectures at seminars, university campuses, and city firms in the UK and abroad, he has, over the last 2 decades, run more than 250 heritage tours in Europe to destinations such as Krakow and Auschwitz, Prague, Paris, Amsterdam, and Budapest. And since 2003, he has specialized in Holocaust education, working with the Imperial War Museum and Yad Vashem. If that wasn't enough, he is also one of the regular voices on the History for the Curious podcast, which looks at historical events, people, and movements, with several episodes covering the Nazis and the Holocaust. Rabbi Hersh, thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
Thank you. Yes, I'm fine. Thank you for welcoming me on board, and I hope I'm able to offer that which is necessary to make this a podcast of note.
By virtue of your appearance, it is already a podcast of note. So let's kick off. So, Purim is very, very soon. Purim is upon us. Now, for those who may not know, what is Purim about, and what does it teach us about anti-Semitism?
Okay, so 2, in a way, different questions there, although there are overlaps and they are interlinked. Purim, in a nutshell, is the story of the plot to wipe out the entire Jewish nation just under 2,500 years ago. It occurred between the first and the second temple period, which means that at the time the Jews were not in their homeland. They were in exile in what would nowadays be Iran, Iraq, the Persian Empire, and in particular the prime minister of the empire, who was a descendant of a particular tribe, Amalek, whose mission almost is to eradicate God from the world, came to an agreement with the king that he would be allowed to eradicate the Jewish people, irrespective of religiosity, men, women, children, and with a combination of prayer, diplomacy, and Jewish unity, we defeated our enemy in a way that would describe Purim without going into details and dates. From the perspective of anti-Semitism, so I guess it is true on 2 levels within the story, on a political, economic level and on a spiritual level. Politically, we need to be aware that there are always those looking to take advantage and will prey on soft targets. And throughout the last 2,000 years, Jews were often presented as being just that, the soft target, whilst they were in exile. They were a minority in a majority host culture. They did not have a country of their own. There was exploitation. And this is true of any country in which the Jews have lived in. They have never been free of the accusations that have accompanied anti-Semitism, irrespective of the century, irrespective of the location. So that is something that comes across and starts from there. In fact, it is summed up in 3 words in the story that we read publicly on Purim, the Megillat Esther, where we say, V'ha'ir Shushan Navocha, which really means that the city of Shushan, the capital city, was confused, and the confusion arose from the fact, why pick on the Jews? They look like their neighbors, they dress like their neighbors, they appear like their neighbors, they've had a similar education to their neighbors. Why are they being singled out? And this is a question that will occur over and over again to any objective reader of history over the past 1900 years. So that's the sort of political, economic level. And then there is a spiritual idea, and that is that we need to be aware that we, as a Jewish people, have a responsibility to act in a manner which is befitting of Jews. We are judged by God to a level that matches that responsibility. And there is cause and effect in what takes place. We might not be able to immediately trace it. The story starts in the 3rd year of the reign of the king, and the main action, so to speak, takes place in the 12th year. And you wouldn't necessarily have connected the dots when there is almost a decade gap between one activity and another. But from the perspective of the Megillah, of this story, we see it all as a continuum.
Well, that sort of leads me on to my next question, which is, what does the evil Haman, who is the villain of the Purim story, he wants to exterminate the Jews, what commonalities does he have with other anti-Semites throughout history?
So I'm not sure if we can compare him to all anti-Semites per se, but definitely those who have been in a position of power, who have been notably anti-Semitic, there definitely is a lot of commonality. The Purim story is essentially the first attempted genocide. The Jewish people had been around for quite a while. They had been living in the land of Israel for almost a millennium prior to the destruction of the first temple. But any of the battles that they had fought prior to the Purim episode had been essentially territorial. And therefore, we see them much within the context of world events, as would occur to any 2 countries that are proximate to one another. Purim is different. It is a time that we are targeted as a people across a range of territories, and it reveals an intensity. In the Purim story itself, we find that the architect of this attempted genocide, Haman, is elevated to a position of almost unbelievable power. Yet, when he sees that there is one Jew who is not falling in line with the general decree to give Haman absolute honor and respect, he tells his cohorts, his wife, his friends, V'chol ze enenu sheveli, all that I have been given, all the honor, all the power that I have is worthless as long as this one Jew doesn't kneel at my command. He is eaten away by it, and it is that irrationality, that absurdity of anti-Semitism that comes across, and therefore, in many ways, all attempts to define anti-Semitism, to label it neatly, to put it in a drawer, in a shoebox and say, this is what anti-Semitism is, won't work. Because at a time there was religious anti-Semitism, and then there was political anti-Semitism, there has been economic anti-Semitism, racial anti-Semitism. Nowadays we experience anti-Semitism through anti-Israel often, and therefore it morphs with the times, as the older one becomes unfashionable, a new one pops up. It cannot be neatly defined, but it is there, and ultimately it's visceral. And we see that from Haman, and it leads in to that which occurs over the next 2,500 years in scenarios that are repeated in different places.
Now, I want to ask you about something really important, which is hamantaschen. So hamantaschen, the cookies that we eat at Purim in the shape of Haman's ear or hat, is this not a bit of an odd way to remember someone who tried to murder the Jewish people? Because we don't treat other anti-Semites in this fashion. Or is this in fact a perfect way of remembering Haman by mocking him and reducing his legacy to that of a snack that we consume?
Right. So I have to say that we can't find direct historical lineage to hamantaschen being grounded in apparel or parts of Haman's body. But given that I enjoy them personally, I am not going to argue the case because I do not want bakeries to stop making them. But on the point of reducing the legend to a snack, I think what it actually is having the last laugh. Longevity is the Jewish response to anti-Semitism. We will ultimately outlive our enemies and celebrate. It's not an easy journey, but it's a very real one. And in other cases of anti-Semitism, the one that is most obvious and closest to our time in terms of the Holocaust, there is a photo that I often share with groups in Poland, and that is of Purim in 1946 in one of the DP camps, displaced persons camps in Germany, where you have a survivor who is imitating someone, and the people around are smiling, are laughing approvingly, and the person that he is imitating is none other than Hitler. And you would think that this is in extremely bad taste, given that he himself and his audience have recently gone through tremendous tragedy and personal loss. But actually, that isn't the case. We respond to tragedy in various ways, but one of them is by understanding that we can ultimately laugh it off. And Jewish humor is replete with these types of examples where we sort of bemoan our situation, but with a little tongue-in-cheek at the same time.
Yeah, very nicely put. Now, let me ask you, how do the celebrations surrounding Purim serve as a way of teaching children about anti-Semitism?
So I would say that our Jewish calendar lives through tragedy and celebration. And therefore, what we try and do is not only acquaint them with our history, with our past, but create a sense of balance, I guess you'd say. It's a very positive educational tool for people to understand that, there are good times and bad times, and for them to be healthy, well-adjusted individuals, it's important to have a full perspective. And when it comes to Tisha B'Av, we might sit on the ground and mourn. And when it comes to Purim, we will celebrate, and we will do so on an ongoing basis to create this sense of balance.
Mm. And what are some of the lasting lessons that we can learn from the story of Purim?
Okay, there are going to be many and varied lessons. Perhaps, given that we are children of the West. One that comes to mind is perhaps lesser known, but quite important and quite relevant to the 21st century. The hero and heroine of Purim are respectively Mordechai and Esther. They are both involved in government affairs. Mordechai is a minister and Esther is the queen. The interesting thing is that the names by which we refer to them in the story are not their Jewish given names. Esther, the Megillah itself tells us that her original name, her Jewish name, if you will, was Hadassah. And Mordechai, the Talmud in the tractate Megillah tells us, was Pesachia. That was his Hebrew name. So you might think, okay, they had a work name. I am called Aubrey. I'm the last one to talk about Hebrew names, although I share that distinction with Abba Eban, who was also from the UK. So, my Hebrew name is Aaron. And therefore you could assume they simply had a work name which they put in their passport and a Hebrew name by which they were referred to amongst their co-religionists. But it actually is deeper than that, because those two names, Mordechai and Esther, are the names of pagan deities. Mordechai is rooted in the word Marduk, which is a Babylonian deity, and Esther is Astarte, which is a Persian deity. And that is the equivalent of calling our Jewish heroes Christopher, or, sort of Mary, which would not be that common and definitely wouldn't be something we would pass on. We would assume, okay, fine, let's at least call our children Hadassah and avoid the Esther name, but we do not. And part of that idea, as I say, it's an idea for us in the West, is that you can be a fully serving member of surrounding society. You can be contributing to the non-Jewish world around you as long as your core identity remains that of the Jew. You can venture out into the wider world as long as the elements that are non-negotiable are going to be the Jew at its core, at its heart.
Now, going on to you now, you have worked extensively in the field of anti-Semitism, specifically Holocaust-related education. What motivated you to become involved in this?
What motivated me? Obviously, the Holocaust is an enormous topic, a very important topic, a contemporary topic. Personally, I lost my grandparents in the Holocaust. I therefore never knew them. A number of my uncles and aunts on my father's side. My mother lived through the Holocaust in France, so it is something that is personal as well as bringing the historical wider element to it. I guess going out to Poland and bringing groups with me and educating out there, I very much feel that it is a topic that can't really adequately be taught in a sterile environment, in a classroom. You need to be in situ. You need to, at least to some degree, try and be in the place or places where these things occurred, and that can animate the process. It's never going to be what actually took place. It was so brutal, so difficult, so much of a tragedy, and the absence of sound more than anything else means that you're never able to replicate it. And I guess, thank God, we're never able to replicate it. But even just the very act of walking through these places evokes memory that is difficult to create when you're outside of that more intense environment. And I have found that uh, trips to places like Auschwitz, to Holocaust locations, are sometimes badly constructed. I have to admit, I am not a fan of 1 day trips to Auschwitz. I feel that unless you sort of wake up in that country, unless you can have an experience of feeling that you're not in your own environment. If you take off from Luton Airport in the morning and you're back in Luton Airport that evening, it is quite difficult to transport yourself to events which took place 80 years ago in very different settings under very different circumstances. And at minimum, you need to wake up in the country and think to yourself, where am I? I think that very much helps the process. And sometimes simply the way in which the tours are run is to talk too much. The process of visiting Holocaust locations is one that requires every individual to think, and it needs to percolate in their own mind, through their own emotions, and there is no singular reaction to being there. There is no reaction which is invalid. People can walk away feeling totally unmoved, or they can feel angry or sad or proud. All of these emotions I've seen in others who've gone through the experience. None of them are incorrect. None of them are required per se, because it is a process. It raises so many issues. It asks so many questions that there needs to be a time for it to be processed, and therefore the educational methods to convey these points are to a certain degree to give the participants food for thought on a variety of levels, and they then need to run with it.
What is it like for you personally to go now after leading so many tours versus going for your first or second time?
So I would very much say that it's no longer my reaction that does anything to me. It is the reaction of the participants. I've been to Poland with groups probably 150 times over the last 20 years. And therefore, unfortunately, the reality is that the places are not going to have a great effect on me. I know exactly where I'm going. I know the timing, how long we will spend in a barracks or in a particular location. But what never fails to amaze me and to move me is the reaction of the people there, irrespective of age, because the concept and the topic is so vast. There is always room for comment, and it often surprises me. It comes from people I wouldn't have expected to have that comment or that insight, but it is constant. I have never been on a trip where that has not occurred, and that is really what turns the tour from being just that, from me being just a tour guide, into something far deeper, far more important, and far more educational.
Mm. What is it like for you taking Jewish first timers to Auschwitz? And do you find different reactions from different age groups?
Yes, you do find different reactions from different age groups. And it therefore ranges not only through the emotional response, but the knowledge base. So if you're taking teenagers, I would not recommend anyone under 17 going to Poland, because the amount to process is such that there needs to be a certain maturity in order to do so. But the younger people are, the more open they tend to be with their emotions, with expressing their emotions. On the other hand, they tend to be less knowledgeable. On the whole, they will not have heard firsthand from people who went through the Holocaust, except perhaps as a preparation to the trip, a 1 hour from a Holocaust survivor, which of course is taking place less and less as time passes, as the amount of survivors who are able and prepared to talk diminishes. But that does mean that the younger generation will be less aware, less knowledgeable of exactly what happened, even if the overall picture is known to them. On the other hand, as I say, it's balanced by the fact that they will be more open with their emotions. And when it comes to people who are middle-aged, clearly there's a very different dynamic. It is also different if people are going couples together, husbands and wives, for instance, where they are sharing that experience together. And if people have young children at home, they will be viewing and hearing what they are experiencing through the lens of, imagine if that was my child. And you can almost see it happening in real time with people who are at that particular stage in life.
Gosh, wow. Going to anti-Semitism more broadly now, I want to talk to you about this traditional idea of Eisav, soneh Yaakov, or Esau hates Jacob, that some people will cite as evidence that anti-Semitism is inevitable. It's inherent, so why bother fighting it? I feel like this way of thinking risks bringing about a feeling of apathy to something that quite literally sees people getting killed. What are your thoughts on this?
So the idea that we find in the writings of the Talmud of the sages, that there is a truism of Eisav and Yaakov, of these two brothers, originally twins, throughout history, having created and sustained an animosity. We do find that as being described as inevitable. But it is, firstly, very important not to generalize this application as applying to all non-Jews. It would be completely remiss and incorrect to define this statement as translating into all non-Jews hate Jews. It's never meant that way. It isn't the context in which it is stated. What it means, rather, is that in each generation, we will have individuals who hate Jews, and if given the ability and the position, will seek to do something about it. But there is an enormous middle ground of people who are neither in one camp nor the other. They are the neutrals, and it would be an absolute mistake to target them, to label them as anti-Semites. That it would just simply be wrong. Equally, it would be wrong to rest on our laurels in the 21st century and say anti-Semitism is a thing of the past. People don't react that way nowadays. Both of those need to be taken in context. And there have been probably 3 different reactions to the fact that anti-Semitism is a constant, and each of these three can point to times and episodes where they were right, and equally they can be shown episodes where they were wrong. There isn't a magic bullet that says this is therefore how you should deal with anti-Semitism. If only it were that simple. Especially because, as an Orthodox Jew, I do not see anti-Semitism simply as having a political origin, but a spiritual one too, and therefore it can't just be eradicated with some sort of magic wand. These three reactions would probably range from disarm the anti-Semite or the non-Jewish intent through charm, meaning show the non-Jewish world how much we can contribute and why we are a vital component and part of the society, and therefore show us the same reaction that you do the others within this cosmopolitan society. That would be one type of reaction. Another one would be, rather than disarm by charm, would be disarm by force. Stand up for yourself, whether it is by sending in an email or on a much more loaded battlefield by fighting as a Jew for the rights and for the beliefs to live in peace and unmolested for crimes that are have not been committed by innocent people. And then there is potentially the third, which is disarm them using what you might call spiritual energy, prayer, and Jewish unity. And as I say, each of them can point to times where it has been used successfully, and sometimes it was the only weapon to hand. We find that Jacob's encounter with Esau, which really started your question, after a 20-year gap, he prepares for all these three eventualities. And therefore, when we talk about, for instance, Soviet Jewry, if the Western world, the Jews in the Western world, had not reacted by protest and by pushing the issue, I'm not sure that we would have achieved the results that we did. And therefore, the, so to speak, force was a weapon that was the weapon of choice for that. Although for those Jews trapped behind the Iron Curtain, they couldn't use force and they couldn't use charm. And really, it was the spiritual weapons that they were using. And you read the accounts of the refuseniks in the gulags, fasting and refusing to give up on their Jewish identity. That's really what they were tapping into. Modern day Israel often uses the first, i.e. the charm, by trying to show the world what is available and what can be achieved through peace. Although obviously they've had to resort to force as well to stand up to war and to other difficulties that have occurred over the last 80 years. So it's a combination, it is a selection, but it is used in different measures by different people, and people have their own proclivity as to which they prefer.
Yeah, thank you very much. That is a very educational, fantastic answer. And, that leads me to get onto your own podcast, because only a true podcaster could have delivered such an answer like that. Let's talk about History for the Curious podcast, in which you regularly feature. Now, can you tell us a bit about this, and who are the sorts of people that might be interested in listening to it?
So it's a podcast that I started about a year and a half ago. I was convinced by my colleagues at the JLE that there is a niche to teach history in this way. And so far, I think we've produced about 80 or so episodes. It's essentially weekly, and we're now getting between 4,000 and 5,000 downloads a week. So clearly it has shown a certain level of popularity, which is, I guess, very nice to know. We don't know who these people are. We only know which country they are, which countries they are in. I describe history for the curious as easy listening for topics of interest in history. Generally, what I try and do is find an idea, an episode, or an individual who, from a macro perspective, from a general sense, is known of, but to home in on narratives that are unknown. And we range across the last 2,000 years, at a time when Britain was going through prime ministers at a rate earlier this year, or really earlier in 2022. We did a 3-part on British prime ministers in history because the Jews have actually been around in England since there has been an English prime minister, and they've experienced, the good, the bad, and the surprising. And we dealt with Harold Wilson, with Winston Churchill. We touched on Disraeli, and it really is the ability to learn more without it being too superficial, and hopefully without it being too academic, so you can listen and appreciate, and hopefully it will continue.
The podcast has produced many episodes on the Holocaust. What is the research and preparation that goes into a project as well researched as this?
Right. So I would say there are similar criteria to find a topic, in the sense that we want it to be something that people are, in a general sense, familiar with, but the specific narrative or the specifics of this topic are pretty much unknown. By way of example, one of the Holocaust episodes that we produced was called The Capo. People know that the function of the capo in the camps, and to a certain extent in the ghettos, was alienating. And yet, Jews undertook this task. But they never really dwell on the person who made these choices, where it came from, and what the outcome was. And in particular, one narrative about a capo in Auschwitz comes with an extremely unusual conclusion, one which contains its own mini tragedy and, in a way, mini triumph. And it was really knowing that narrative that animated the podcast episode into being. Or, for instance, the one we did on calendars, Jewish time, especially, for instance, for an Orthodox Jew who has lost all track of time. When is Yom Kippur? When are these vital days of the month, of the year, even of the week? You lost track of time. You didn't know when Shabbat was. How did they cope with that? And under what circumstances were calendars produced? So, generally speaking, we might be familiar with the concept. We won't be familiar with the story. It requires a lot of research, as can be expected. As you say, it's a topic, or generally the Holocaust is a topic that is very well researched and very much written about. So finding those areas that are more niche does require quite a degree of input. But once again, to avoid that which is too academic, and equally to avoid that which is a little superficial, or stories which are unattributed. I want to make sure that I've got provenance on what I'm saying, so that the audience is hearing something that is true.
Now, podcast aside, you also serve as the senior lecturer and project director at the Jewish Learning Exchange, the JLE. What does this involve? And for those who are unfamiliar, what exactly does the JLE do?
So the JLE is an adult educational and social centre for those between 17 and 35. It offers the ability for the young 21st century Jew to find out more about their heritage, to become more knowledgeable about Judaism in a very welcoming social environment. And I've been there since the mid-90s. Part of what I do is obviously teach. Part of it is management related. We have a department that deals with campus, one that deals with young professionals. We have a French department. We have a women's department, a men's department. So there is a lot going on, a lot to cover. And really anyone who wants to learn more or know more, either look us up on our website, jle.org.uk, or pop into our main centre on Golders Green Road. And, we'll welcome you, as we have welcomed tens of thousands of others over the last few decades.
Fantastic. Rabbi, I'm going to ask you a question now that I ask all of our guests, which is, if someone who is not Jewish approaches you and says that they want to help in the fight against anti-Semitism, where should they start?
So I think that anybody who has an interest in doing so should see themselves as no more, so to speak, than the first line of defense. They don't have to personally be able to defend Jews and potentially Israel and Judaism from every attack that is thrown at it, nor do they have to be knowledgeable enough that they are able to reply at length to any question asked of them. They really just need to know certain basics. There is a fantastic website that I can recommend, and that is jewishvirtuallibrary.org. They have an entire section just on anti-Semitism, as well as sections on Judaism as a whole, Israel, politically, economically, spiritually. But jewishvirtuallibrary.org is a fabulous resource. And there is on the internet, in terms of lectures, in terms of that which has been spoken of responding to particular accusations, there is a lot there, obviously, that can be used, but they should see themselves as a first line of defense and not as the be-all and end-all of all, of all of Jewry worldwide.
Now, please tell the listeners, what have you got going on and where can people find you?
Oh, personally, well, one of the things that I do through the offices of the JLE is I run heritage trips to Europe, a combination of Jewish history, the Jewish community as it stands at the moment, as well as some of the secular history that exists in these locations. I've run a few hundred to Europe in the last couple of decades. And I guess the easiest way to find out what is happening is to email, which is aubrey@jle.org.uk. And then, of course, there is the weekly podcast, History for the Curious, which is available on the various media platforms. And if you want to pop into the JLE, I'm always happy to say hi.
All right. Rabbi Aubrey Hersh, thank you so much for coming on Podcast Against Antisemitism.
Thank you very much for having me, and I wish you and all the viewers and listeners a happy Purim.